I am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 91, Tranquility. As the number of new queen ants gradually increased, the swarm's population grew at an even faster rate. In just over 200 days, the swarm had recovered to its pre-war scale. Bases that had been abandoned during the war were restored and rebuilt. Several armies resumed their expeditions in batches. In addition to the original 4 armies heading east, west, north, and central, a new southern army was also established. It could be said that the swarm was now advancing in all directions, with no natural barriers or external forces capable of halting its progress. Perhaps the war with the Yellow Earth Ant Legion had already touched the ceiling of this region's combat power. In the days that followed, the swarm faced little resistance, encountering no formidable enemies. Ant nests like those of the big-headed ants, which had once seemed imposing, were now nothing more than minor obstacles to the swarm. When confronted with the exploratory armies, they couldn't even stir up a ripple. The swarm's military strategy was now remarkably straightforward. For smaller colonies, like those of the black ants, there wasn't much to say, just directly overwhelm their nests. A single exploratory squad could handle them effortlessly. For larger colonies, such as the red ants, which numbered in the millions, multiple exploratory squads would combine their forces to deal with them. Once gathered, they would openly engage in battle at the entrance of the opposing nest. However, all armies were now equipped with dual-layered long-range firepower units. These units followed the main forces closely, and whenever a squad encountered an enemy numbering in the hundreds of thousands, they would call for firepower support. Without comparable firepower, most engagements were resolved with a single barrage of covering fire, followed by a frontal assault from the vanguard, ensuring swift victories. Even when facing big-headed ants with populations in the millions, a certain degree of respect was warranted. Nevertheless, the outcomes were no different from those against smaller groups. Just a few more rounds of firepower and charges to seal the deal. 10 kilometers. 100 kilometers. 1,000 kilometers. As time passed, the swarm's territory expanded continuously. Without any natural predators, the swarm developed at an astonishing pace, growing to an immeasurable size. Luo Wen had long since lost precise control over the swarm. It wasn't because the swarm had betrayed him; they remained loyal to him, and his will still permeated every aspect of the swarm. The problem he faced was the same old issue: communication. The swarm lacked an effective means of communication. When the territory was still small, communication bugs were responsible for relaying messages. Later, as the territory expanded, faster transport bugs were employed to carry communication bugs and transmit messages. Now, however, the transport bug remained the fastest unit, but the territory had grown exponentially. For Luo Wen to send a message to the exploratory armies on the borders, even with transport bugs running day and night, it would take months before the queen ants of the distant armies received the message. Such inefficiency could prove catastrophic if the swarm encountered an evenly matched enemy. Fortunately, the swarm was currently too powerful. Even in Epheish's homeland, the land of the transcendent wizards, while a single insect might not be their match, even 1,000,000 or 10,000,000 insects might not suffice. The swarm could still demonstrate what it meant to bring despair without end. Luo Wen mused that if that green-haired wizard had succeeded in its rebellion, he might have taken an alternative path. Even if individual combat strength was negligible, the collective power of the swarm had already reached the level of city and national destruction. Of course, these thoughts were merely Luo Wen's idle musings. At present, he couldn't even think of ways to court death. Everywhere he looked, it was all swarm territory, devoid of threats. He had already experienced free falling from great heights back when he was the size of a fingernail, and now, he had even learned to dive. With the constant integration of new genes, things capable of threatening him had dwindled to the point of non-existence. Perhaps this was the terror of Epheish. As the swarm's territory extended over the years, environmental differences in various regions occasionally birthed unique ant species and bugs. Whenever they appeared, they added ripples to Luo Wen's otherwise tranquil life, one of his few remaining sources of excitement. Most of these bugs, however, offered redundant traits, although a few managed to surprise him. For instance, a species of red and black ants possessed exceptionally developed mandibular glands that ran from their heads to their abdomens. When encountering powerful enemies, they would bite down on their foes, contract their muscles, and self-destruct. The toxic fluid in their glands would splatter everywhere, causing significant area damage with its potent mix of poisonous substances. Another species exhibited a similar ability. They had 2 crystalline structures between their thorax and abdomen. When they needed to self-destruct, these crystals would react with secretions from their salivary glands, producing a highly toxic substance. Their explosions were directional, ensuring a one-for-one trade at the very least. This was a talent Luo Wen had once feared might awaken within him, yet to his amazement, certain bugs actually possessed such capabilities. Incorporating their genes created a new type of unit for the swarm, albeit in limited numbers due to their lack of practical use. Another interesting ant species lived in trees, carving tunnels into the trunks to build their nests. The entrance was small, allowing only one ant through at a time. With limited territory confined to their trees, their access to resources was minimal, which naturally limited their population. When faced with invaders, they couldn't engage in head-on confrontations like other species. Instead, they devised a unique defensive strategy. Some of these ants developed mutations that gave them rounded or rectangular chitinous shields on their heads. When intruders approached, these mutants would block the nest entrance with their heads. Invaders often found it difficult to deal with these sturdy shields and would leave after a period of stalemate. This ability was intriguing but held little value for the swarm, which no longer needed to defend against enemies. Luo Wen only created a few as decorations. There was also a type of ant soldier whose head sprouted a cannon-like structure capable of spraying a resin-like substance with immense adhesive properties. Though non-toxic and lacking direct lethality, it was an excellent control mechanism. Luo Wen enhanced their genes with several types of toxins, creating a hybrid artillery bug capable of both controlling and killing. With their elongated barrels, their shots were highly focused, avoiding dispersion. After Luo Wen's improvements, their range extended to 20-30 meters, with precise targeting at 15 meters, making them perfect for sniping high-value targets. Now, numerous such artillery bugs served in the border armies. Additionally, Luo Wen absorbed other fascinating traits into the gene pool whenever they proved useful. Chapter 92, Underwater Breathing. Time passed unnoticed, and Luo Wen had long since stopped bothering to calculate its passage. The prolonged peace in the swarm's territory meant that many worker ants had never set foot on a battlefield since hatching. This peaceful existence even allowed them the rare opportunity to die of old age. As batches of worker ants perished, new ones were seamlessly added, ensuring the swarm's operations were unaffected. The Northern Army had been advancing along a river, undergoing various course changes but generally maintaining its direction. Recently, a message came from the Queen Ant accompanying the army. The forces had encountered an exceptionally wide river that blocked their path. While the aquatic units accompanying the army explored the river, they suffered heavy losses. Yet, it seemed they hadn't encountered any enemies. The report was contradictory and unclear, prompting Luo Wen to investigate personally. As he traveled farther north, the temperature dropped noticeably. However, due to the planet's significant day-night temperature differences, even desert cliffs could freeze at night. The local plants and insects had developed strong cold resistance, and the swarm's genetic adaptations made it impervious to such conditions. The flora gradually shifted from broad-leafed plants to conifers as the temperature continued to decline. Along the way, Luo Wen even experienced a sudden snowstorm. Though it lasted only half an hour before clearing, the ground accumulated nearly 20 centimeters of snow in that short time. For Luo Wen, with his long legs, the snow posed no obstacle. However, for smaller insects, even those with cold resistance, being trapped in snow and ice could be deadly. After several days of arduous travel, Luo Wen finally reached the so-called riverbank. This is a riverbank? Looking out at the vast expanse of water, with occasional drifting ice and a distinctly salty taste, Luo Wen couldn't help but scoff. While the Queen Ant's lack of worldly experience was forgivable, Luo Wen, who had been bombarded with information in his past life and had even seen the real thing, recognized this as a sea. Had the swarm's forces already reached the seashore? This was Luo Wen's first question. Having spent his days in a cycle of eating and sleeping, he had lost track of how much time had passed. Did this planet also have oceans? This was Luo Wen's second question. After all, this was an unfamiliar world to him. Excitement soon bubbled up within him. The ocean undoubtedly concealed countless species, and there might be excellent genes waiting to be harvested. Not long after, he found the Northern Army. The key to quickly locating them after traveling thousands of kilometers lay in Luo Wen following the river originating near the brood nest. After winding through various tributaries, it merged with a larger river and eventually flowed into the ocean. The Northern Army was stationed near this point, leaving pheromone trails along the riverbank to guide Luo Wen to their camp. When Luo Wen arrived at the site, he found a massive underground base had been excavated, complete with mushroom farms. Despite the freezing temperatures, the mushrooms radiated heat, making the interior of the burrow as warm as spring. Unfortunately, the ants seemed to have forgotten to construct a passage large enough for Luo Wen, leaving him to endure the cold outside. This base was home to only a small detachment of 5 or 6 million ants. The main northern army had long since moved on. After all, it took months for messages to travel back and forth. Given the army's size, it couldn't stay in one place for long, as it needed to continuously advance to secure food supplies. The detachment remained behind to await Luo Wen and assist with his operations and experiments. The moment Luo Wen saw the ocean, he understood why the Queen Ant's report had been contradictory. The raft bugs and submersible bugs hadn't encountered any enemies. Instead, they had perished because their physiology was designed for fresh water and lacked components to filter salt. When they entered the seawater, they were likely overwhelmed by the salinity and died. With no enemies present, exploration became the next priority. During Luo Wen's journey, the detachment had made some progress. They hunted several crustaceans resembling crabs, hermit crabs, and shrimp along the coast. These species were precisely what Luo Wen needed before beginning his oceanic explorations. After consuming samples from each, Luo Wen dug himself a burrow. He then had the burrower ants dig a heat-dissipating channel from the plantation in the base to his room, providing a heater. Once comfortably settled, he rested. When he awoke, Luo Wen noticed the absence of a molted shell in his burrow, which puzzled him. Inspecting his body carefully, he found no discernible changes, no crab-like book gills or other peculiar features. Scratching his head awkwardly, he muttered, "Strange? Why haven't I grown new respiratory organs?" He speculated that his existing organs might have mutated, a theory requiring practical testing to confirm. Fortunately, the ocean wasn't far. Luo Wen quickly made his way to the shoreline with his long legs. On second thought, he hesitated. It wasn't entirely safe to use himself as a test subject. What if he couldn't tolerate the salinity? The safest approach would be to return to the brood nest to analyze his genes, but the round trip would take too long, and Luo Wen was too impatient to wait. Thus, he crawled toward the estuary where the river met the ocean, creating a transitional zone between fresh water and seawater, a safer place to experiment. Starting in the fresh water, Luo Wen slowly entered the water. Thanks to his acquired diving ability, he wasn't nervous. As the river water engulfed him, he immediately noticed a difference. This time, breathing felt much easier than before. Evidently, a change had occurred. He tried sealing the ventilation pores linking the air sacs between his carapace and abdomen. In the past, doing so would have caused instant suffocation. Yet this time, he felt no such discomfort. He could now breathe underwater naturally. This was true underwater respiration, extracting oxygen directly from the water, unlike his previous pseudo-underwater breathing, which relied on carrying an oxygen tank. Carefully sensing his body, Luo Wen identified the changes. There were two. First, his carapace could filter water, extracting dissolved oxygen to sustain his body. Second, thin membranous structures had grown at the bases of his legs, protruding from the body wall and filled with capillaries. These membranes could also filter water and salt while extracting oxygen. The membrane's location was so hidden and in Luo Wen's blind spot that he hadn't noticed them before. The carapace changes were even more subtle, with no outward signs. These subtle modifications explained why Luo Wen hadn't initially realized his new abilities. Chapter 93, Into the Sea, 1. Having discovered his new adaptations, Luo Wen trudged through the muddy riverbed, slowly heading toward the river's mouth. The increasingly salty seawater posed no issue for Luo Wen, as his newly developed underwater respiratory system perfectly filtered out the salt content. As he exited the river and ventured into the ocean, the underwater landscape left him somewhat disappointed. Perhaps due to the cold waters, underwater vegetation was scarce. However, the seabed's rocky crevices teemed with shrimp and crabs, some of which even attempted to ambush Luo Wen. Luo Wen's claws remained formidable weapons even underwater, though the resistance from the water made them cumbersome, leaving him little success against the nimble shrimp. However, the crabs that boldly brandished their claws at him didn't fare as well. Luo Wen easily dispatched many of them. Unfortunately, he couldn't eat underwater, nor could he conveniently carry them, leaving him no choice but to abandon this feast of ultra-fresh seafood. As he advanced along the seabed, the water grew deeper, and the pressure exerted on him increased. However, his exoskeleton appeared to have a natural resistance to pressure, so he experienced no significant discomfort. By the time Luo Wen descended to a depth of over 300 meters, sunlight from the surface barely reached this level. While his unique compound eyes allowed him to see in low light, they were powerless in absolute darkness. At around 400 meters deep, the surroundings were utterly black. Fear of the unknown compelled Luo Wen to halt his descent. He inflated the air sacs between his carapace and abdomen, causing his body to ascend slowly toward the surface. As he rose, his surroundings gradually became visible again. Suddenly, a mantis shrimp-like creature darted out of the darkness below, charging toward him at high speed. At just over 10 centimeters long, the creature posed no real threat to Luo Wen, though its agility made it challenging for him to deal with. Although Luo Wen's movements couldn't match the mantis shrimp's swiftness, his excellent dynamic visual system captured its every move. This mantis shrimp differed from the ones he remembered. Its two front limbs weren't sharp scythes but rather small hammers. The mantis shrimp twisted agilely in the water, closing the distance in a few swift movements. Luo Wen clumsily extended a claw to fend it off, hoping the creature might foolishly blunder into his grip. If the mantis shrimp could speak, it would likely retort, "Keep dreaming." The shrimp suddenly collided with one of Luo Wen's large claws and immediately retaliated. Luo Wen caught a fleeting flash of light in the corner of his eye, followed by a heavy strike against his claw. Luo Wen realized that the mantis shrimp had attacked him with its hammer-like appendages, but even with his dynamic vision, he couldn't clearly follow the attack. After a moment, the mantis shrimp seemed to sense that this massive creature wasn't worth provoking. It quickly turned and vanished into the dark depths. Since growing to his current size, Luo Wen had never been so brazenly challenged. However, glancing at the boundless and shadowy ocean, he knew it would be difficult to avenge himself. Upon surfacing, Luo Wen oriented himself and discovered he was several kilometers from shore. He raised the claw that had been struck and noticed a faint crack. Though the damage was minor, the insult stung deeply, leaving him fuming. After calming down, Luo Wen marveled at the shrimp's strength. His claw was one of the most heavily armored parts of his body. Despite the size disparity, the shrimp's attack had caused visible damage. This wasn't some underhanded trick involving poison. The shrimp's raw power was astonishing. If Luo Wen had been its size, his armor might have been shattered instantly. Since Luo Wen only had one pair of swimming legs, his movement speed in the water was relatively slow. Fortunately, he wasn't in a hurry, and the sea around him was dotted with enormous icebergs, seemingly drifting down from even farther north. Suddenly, his gaze fixed on one of the icebergs. Frozen inside was a strange, oval-shaped, flat-bodied insect of an unknown species. This was a pleasant surprise. Luo Wen had never seen this insect before, and consuming it would likely grant him new genetic fragments. Though uncertain of its utility, he clambered onto the iceberg and laboriously chipped away at the ice with his claw to extract the insect. It was unclear whether the insect was alive or dead. Judging by its appearance, it had been frozen for a long time and was probably lifeless. Still, thanks to being kept on ice, it was impressively fresh. After enjoying a snack, Luo Wen spent some time returning to shore. For now, there wasn't much left for him to do here. Exploring the ocean alone wasn't practical, and he didn't particularly enjoy the cold environment. Although his cold resistance was decent, the chill still dulled his senses, an unpleasant sensation. He ordered the detachment to continue their coastal operations and began his journey back to the brood nest. Upon returning, Luo Wen linked with the brood nest. The first task was to update the pending queen ant production orders, incorporating the new underwater breathing system. As for the frozen insect, genetic analysis revealed its secrets. It possessed a unique hibernation ability, allowing it to enter a dormant state. When Luo Wen had unearthed it, it hadn't been dead, merely in hibernation. No wonder it was so fresh and odor-free. Luo Wen smacked his lips, reminiscing about the seafood's flavor. This talent seemed useless for now, so he set it aside. Several dozen days later, the first batch of upgraded queen ants matured, and Luo Wen immediately dispatched them to establish a base at the coast. Over 100 days later, a dead mantis shrimp was brought to Luo Wen. Having endured a journey of several thousand kilometers, the shrimp was now rotten and reeked unbearably. Luo Wen, though less particular than before, still found it inedible. Determined to savor fresh seafood sashimi, Luo Wen made another arduous trip to the coastal base. By now, the base had expanded significantly and was overseen by a single Type 2 queen ant. The base welcomed Luo Wen without fanfare, merely preparing his old heated room for his use. After resting for a day, Luo Wen watched as the swarm's naval units embarked on their mission. Due to the base's limited capacity with only one Type 2 queen ant, the number of seaworthy units was modest, comprising just 2 types of creatures. One was modeled after crabs, while the other was based on shrimp. Each had its advantages. The crab-based units boasted powerful claws and robust shells, granting them high offensive and defensive capabilities, though their mobility was poor. The shrimp-based units, while weaker in attack and defense, utilized a darting swimming method that provided swift movement and erratic trajectories. As for the mantis shrimp, it excelled in both speed and agility, with formidable defense and unparalleled attack power, making it a true overlord of the sea. Thus, relying solely on crabs and shrimp to hunt mantis shrimp would require considerable luck. Chapter 94, Into the Sea, 2. The shrimp units could match the mantis shrimp in speed, but their attacks were too weak to penetrate its armor, relegating them to reconnaissance roles. Fortunately, mantis shrimp often hid in the sandy seabed, lying in wait to ambush passing prey. Coincidentally, such areas were also the crab's domain. After several hours of patrolling, hundreds of shrimp scouts finally located a mantis shrimp at a depth of over 200 meters. The crabs soon received the coordinates and moved in. To avoid alarming the mantis shrimp, only 2 crabs approached its hiding place. Perhaps because the crabs were similar in size to the mantis shrimp, it chose to attack rather than flee. It lunged at one crab, which hurriedly raised its claw in defense. Yet, as the mantis shrimp darted past, one of the crab's claws was severed, floating away. However, the mantis shrimp underestimated the swarm's collective combat tactics. The 2 crabs had deliberately lured it out. When it paused momentarily to prepare for another strike, the second crab seized the opportunity, leaping forward and pinning the mantis shrimp with its claws. The mantis shrimp, covered in spikes, struggled fiercely. While the crab's carapaces provided excellent defense, their abdominal armor was relatively soft, and the mantis shrimp managed to pierce them in several places. The injured crab, now reduced to a single claw, used it to grip the mantis shrimp's head and carapace seam. In retaliation, the mantis shrimp unleashed a hammer strike, severing the crab's remaining claw. Even so, the detached claw remained lodged in the mantis shrimp's carapace seam, severely hindering its movements. At this point, the shrimp scouts, which had been waiting nearby, swarmed in. Though incapable of damaging the mantis shrimp's armor, they pushed it toward the crab army. Once surrounded by dozens of crabs, the mantis shrimp's fate was sealed. After savoring a fresh mantis shrimp sashimi dish, Luo Wen indulged in a feast of wild crabs and shrimp before hurriedly returning to the brood nest. Uploading the new genetic data left him astounded. No wonder the mantis shrimp was a dominant predator of the sea. It boasted a wealth of genetic black technology. After a deep sleep, Luo Wen molted a layer of his claw's armor. While his claws didn't transform into hammers, they gained new structures, and even the armor itself underwent changes. However, an accident occurred during testing. A month later, the swarm version of the mantis shrimp was complete. After various tests, Luo Wen gained a deeper understanding of its capabilities. The first notable feature was its eyes. Equipped with 6 pupils, the eyes could perceive a broader range of colors. While these eyes weren't entirely compatible with Luo Wen's biology, partial integration allowed him to experience a richer and more vivid world. The second and most remarkable trait was its hammer-like forelimbs. A 10 cm long mantis shrimp could generate a force exceeding 150 kg with its hammer, which explained how it had cracked Luo Wen's armor. Its hammer strikes were blisteringly fast, accelerating from 0 to 80 km per hour in just 1/300 th of a second. This speed created a supercavitation effect, where collapsing bubbles produced a small shockwave and briefly heated the surrounding water to extreme temperatures, emitting a flash of light. Luo Wen realized the flash he'd seen during the mantis shrimp's attack came from this phenomenon, visible only with highly sensitive eyes. Achieving such speeds required more than just physical strength, it necessitated intricate body mechanics. The mantis shrimp's forelimbs featured a hyperbolic system, which stored energy through contraction and released it explosively to launch the hammer. Moreover, this extraordinary mechanism relied on a specialized material. The mantis shrimp's hammer was covered in a 3-layered nanostructure that absorbed energy, resisted cracking, and provided exceptional impact resistance. Despite its impressive resilience, this material had limitations. It could only support the mantis shrimp's hammer at its current size of roughly 1 cm. Any larger, and catastrophic failure would occur. Don't ask how Luo Wen discovered this. When he first acquired the technology, he was ecstatic. Rushing to test it, he fully activated the hyperbolic ejection system. The result? A loud sonic boom followed by Luo Wen being violently flung through the air. Worse yet, his claw was forcibly torn from his body and hurled into the distance. Subsequent examination revealed that while the claw had adopted the new nanostructure, it suffered severe burn damage. Thankfully, being severed from Luo Wen's body spared him any direct harm. However, the pain of losing a claw was unbearable, leaving Luo Wen writhing in agony. He began questioning whether retaining a nervous system that could register pain truly counted as an evolutionary advantage. After extensive experiments using mantis shrimp genetics, Luo Wen determined the limits of the system. The maximum hammer size that could withstand the stresses was roughly 2 centimeters, and the system only functioned effectively underwater, where the water could rapidly cool the heat generated by the hyperbolic ejection. Anything larger was a death sentence, as Luo Wen had painfully discovered. Fortunately, he could regenerate his limbs, emerging whole after molting in a cocoon. Given Luo Wen's size of over 60 centimeters, with claws whose main structure alone spanned nearly 30 centimeters, it was impossible to wield a 2-centimeter hammer. The thought of such a setup was simply too humiliating for him to consider. Additionally, the system was only lethal against similarly sized targets. When the mantis shrimp ambushed Luo Wen, it had only managed to create a small crack in his claw. For Luo Wen, the system was akin to a chicken rib, unsatisfying to use but too valuable to discard. Reluctant to waste such a hard-earned technology, he conducted countless tests and adjustments. After losing countless claws and molting multiple times, Luo Wen finally managed to modify the system. This modification was essentially a severe downgrade. Luo Wen sealed off most of the hyperbolic system's power, weakening it repeatedly until it was manageable. Even so, the improved system increased Luo Wen's claw speed several-fold. Combined with his enhanced dynamic visual tracking, he was confident that if he encountered a mantis shrimp again, he could give it a surprise of his own. Chapter 95 The Time Has Come. As time passed, the Eastern and Western armies traversed mountains and rivers, pushing the swarm's territory to the ocean. Only the Southern Army, after conquering the vast desert, pressed on for thousands of kilometers without encountering any sign of the sea. On land, the swarm had become the undisputed ruler. The next frontier was the ocean. Perhaps, by crossing the boundless sea, new continents could be discovered elsewhere on the planet. Along the coastlines marking the edge of the swarm's domain, naval bases sprang up one after another. Large numbers of mantis shrimp, crabs, and other aquatic units were deployed to explore the ocean's depths and breadths. Just as the swarm was about to make a massive push into the sea, Luo Wen felt that familiar sense of opportunity during his connection with the brood nest. This time, it was not vague or elusive but clear and unmistakable. In an instant, Luo Wen experienced an epiphany. The time has come. A sharp screech erupted from his mouth, his antennae thrashing violently as pheromones carrying commands filled the air. For a moment, the surrounding insects seemed to pause, frozen in time. Then, as if an unseen switch had been flipped, life resumed. The insects received their instructions and began spreading the orders like wildfire. Transport bugs carried messenger units, rushing off in all directions. From the brood nest as the epicenter, the command spread outward to the subsidiary bases. Though the instructions were unusual, the swarm, as extensions of Luo Wen, obeyed him with absolute loyalty and without question. Type 2 queen ants in the bases issued commands, resulting in the destruction of nearby aphid farms. The once pampered aphids, accustomed to a life of luxury fed at leisure and having their waste meticulously cleaned, were suddenly betrayed by their caretakers. Sharp mandibles pierced their bodies, and they were wrapped in a mixture of syrup and saliva to prevent spoilage. Packaged. Loaded. Transported. The underground plantations suffered a similar fate, subjected to destructive harvesting. Sustainability was abandoned, even roots and seedlings were uprooted, packed, and preserved. Wild insects within the swarm's territory met grim fates as well. They were subjected to carpet-style eradication. Even the agile and evasive grasshoppers couldn't escape the relentless sweep. After gathering every scrap of food they could carry, the insects from the subsidiary bases began their grand migration toward the brood nest. From an aerial perspective, the vast lands below were dotted with abandoned bases as the swarm relinquished their habitats. They packed everything and converged on a single destination. The region surrounding the brood nest swelled with insects as time went on. During the war with the Yellow Earth Ant Legion, the swarm had been decimated to a tenth of its size. Yet, in just over 200 days, it had recovered to its pre-war numbers of tens of billions. Now, after so much time had passed, with tens of thousands of new queen ants in production, the swarm's numbers had grown beyond reckoning. Despite the insects bringing all their supplies to the brood nest, the sheer number of mouths to feed resulted in massive consumption. Only the resources from nearby areas reached the brood nest with surplus supplies intact. From farther distances, food was mostly consumed during the journey. Fortunately, the insects had a unique talent for eating dirt. While it didn't provide much energy, it was enough to sustain their basic vital functions. The densely packed swarm blanketed the area around the brood nest. For those with a fear of crowded spaces, the sight would have been utterly nightmarish. The ground in this vast region had sunk over 10 meters due to the sheer volume of insects consuming soil. They absorbed a fraction of the nutrients before excreting the rest. Under normal circumstances, these excretions were excellent fertilizer, carried by worker ants to nearby trees. But now, with countless trillions of insects gathered, they produced mountains of waste daily, far beyond any effort to transport it away. Instead, the waste was reused repeatedly. Over 100 days later, even the aquatic unit's raft bugs, submersible bugs, and others had followed the rivers to congregate in the lake near the brood nest. The pivotal moment had finally arrived. On a sunny morning, Luo Wen took a deep breath, gazing at the towering black insect mountains surrounding him. He turned and crawled underground, reconnecting his tail to the brood nest after a long hiatus. All surface-level insects were driven above ground. Luo Wen didn't want anything witnessing the shameful posture required for this process. After all, this was his final form. Calming his thoughts, a piercing screech echoed through the earth. A strange wave of energy radiated from Luo Wen's body, spreading rapidly outward with the sound. Every insect touched by this wave froze briefly before assuming a howling stance. Though many of them were voiceless soldier types, at that moment, they seemed to scream with their very souls. The growing chorus, as more insects joined, rose from faint whispers to earth-shaking roars. Threads of unique energy lifted from the insects, converging on Luo Wen. In Luo Wen's compound eyes, a faint white light appeared, gradually intensifying until it shone 3 feet outward, illuminating the entire underground base. As the gathered energy increased, a qualitative transformation occurred. The dazzling white light took on an eerie, regal purple hue. One by one, the insects closest to Luo Wen expended their mysterious energy, freezing in their howling postures, forever locked in this moment. Despite their small size, the swarm's staggering numbers unleashed an unimaginable force. The insect mountains fell silent, yet Luo Wen's screech grew sharper and more resonant. Finally, the last insect gave its all. At the same time, Luo Wen's screech abruptly ceased. The white-purple glow in his eyes dimmed and receded. Luo Wen's consciousness blurred. The extreme exhaustion was not physical but spiritual, leaving him powerless to resist the pull of sleep. He needed a long hibernation to digest these changes. The brood nest, now withered and shrunken, disconnected from Luo Wen. Summoning his last reserves of energy, he crawled along a pre-dug tunnel toward the depths of the earth. The tunnel led 300 meters underground to a small chamber, barely spacious enough to accommodate Luo Wen. Reinforced countless times by worker ants and mucus bugs, it could withstand earthquakes and other natural disasters. After reaching the chamber, Luo Wen destroyed the tunnel behind him, sealing the entrance. Now without the swarm's protection and uncertain how long he would slumber, caution was paramount. Having completed his preparations, Luo Wen succumbed to the exhaustion of his spirit and fell into a deep sleep. As he slept, a liquid oozed from his body, gradually forming a cocoon that encased him entirely. Chapter 96, The Ever-Changing Seas and Lands. Luo Wen had grossly underestimated the duration of his slumber. Though it wasn't unusual for a transcendent being from another world like him to possess peculiar talents, the shift in environment had caused his abilities to mutate beyond his control. After Luo Wen's disappearance, the insect swarm navy wreaked havoc along the coastlines for some time. However, without the ability to reproduce, they gradually faded into history. Arthropods and crustaceans once again claimed dominance in these areas. Meanwhile, deep-sea fish began to venture into the shallows and even attempted to invade the land. Yet, they were no match for the armored, sharp-clawed crustaceans and arthropods that roamed the shores. Despite their agility, these fish remained at the bottom of the food chain. On land, the ecosystem suffered catastrophic damage from the swarm's devastating rampage, leaving behind no eggs or larvae. The disappearance of insects disrupted the ecological balance, giving plants an unprecedented opportunity to flourish. Vegetation grew increasingly dense, absorbing vast amounts of carbon dioxide. As the carbon settled with the decay of plants, atmospheric carbon levels plummeted, leading to a drop in surface temperatures. The plants withered, life dwindled, and the planet became shrouded in frost. Luo Wen, who was supposed to awaken during this period, had consumed a frozen insect on a whim. This insect carried a hyperhibernation gene that was triggered by Luo Wen's condition and the surrounding environment. Thus, Luo Wen fell into an even deeper slumber, one that was far more profound. As time passed, the ice-covered planet amassed underground energy that could no longer be contained. The pressure eventually culminated in volcanic eruptions. Molten material from beneath the surface broke through the ice, releasing vast amounts of carbon back into the atmosphere. Volcanic ash blanketed the skies. Contrary to expectations of further cooling due to the lack of sunlight, the continuous volcanic activity raised the planet's temperature. Thick layers of ice melted into water vapor that ascended into the skies. High above, the water vapor cooled and, mixed with volcanic ash, fell back to the ground as nutrient-rich rain. Life seized this moment to thrive. Vegetation absorbed the abundant minerals and nutrients from the mantle, sprouting rapidly and releasing large quantities of oxygen. The rising oxygen levels allowed marine organisms to once again attempt their migration to land. A peculiar species of deep-sea fish succeeded in making landfall. The dominance of crustaceans and arthropods was upended by this new arrival. These fish had an epoch-defining innovation, the vertebral column. Vertebrate animals, benefiting from the oxygen-rich environment, grew progressively larger. In contrast, crustaceans and arthropods, though no longer constrained by respiratory limitations in a highly oxygenated atmosphere, faced another challenge. Their exoskeletal armor hindered their ability to grow larger without frequent molting. In primitive conditions, molting required significant energy and left them vulnerable during recovery, ultimately dooming their attempts at gigantism. The few arthropods that succeeded in growing larger did so by retreating to the ocean depths. On land, their efforts invariably failed. Over time, these armored creatures were forced into the lower rungs of the food chain, their habitats encroached upon by the ever-expanding vertebrates. Some vertebrates refrained from growing larger and instead occupied ecological niches formerly held by insects. Others, exploiting the abundant oxygen, pursued gigantism, with some species developing thick keratin layers akin to exoskeletal armor. Meanwhile, insects under pressure began to adapt. One day, certain species unfolded their elytra to reveal wings, a revolutionary adaptation that allowed them to conquer a new ecological niche. This newfound ability to fly was one of evolution's rare success stories achieved with minimal cost. Flying insects, leveraging their unique talents, regained their foothold in the biosphere. Some insects sacrificed their hard exoskeletons to achieve larger sizes, while others prioritized speed and agility. Soon after, vertebrates also took to the skies. Unlike the insect's seemingly effortless adaptation, vertebrates modified their forelimbs into wings. With their larger sizes, flying vertebrates quickly dominated the skies, soaring higher and farther to become the new aerial overlords. Thus, vertebrates came to dominate the land and sky. Only the oceans remained a bastion for a few large crustaceans and arthropods. This ecological evolution occurred on an unnamed alien planet. Any resemblance to Earth is purely coincidental. A green beetle, about 2 to 3 centimeters in size, buzzed its transparent, delicate wings as it searched for food in a patch of low-lying grass. The intricate patterns on its wings were clearly visible. A massive earthquake had recently devastated the area, destroying its familiar hunting grounds. Forced to explore unfamiliar territory, the beetle sought its fortune elsewhere. Suddenly, a flesh-colored streak darted past, and the green beetle vanished. Not far from where the incident occurred, a 20-centimeter-tall giant frog with dark green skin was lazily swallowing something. Its tympanic membranes swelled and contracted as it let out a satisfied gwugwa, its relaxed expression exuding contentment. The frog's ears, located behind its eyes, resembled small buttons from afar. Its sensitive ears caught an unusual sound, but it didn't move. Confident in its extraordinary dynamic vision, it believed no creature could ambush it. This blind confidence proved fatal. A violent gust heralded the approach of something fast and deadly. The frog, sensing danger, prepared to leap, but before it could act, an unknown force slammed it into the ground. As the dust settled, the culprit revealed itself, a massive, fearsome claw-like appendage. Its surface was dotted with crater-like pits lined with fine hairs. The claw's sharp tip was embedded in the frog's body. Though the frog wasn't dead yet, its fate was sealed. Following the appendage to its source, one could see it belonged to a 60-centimeter-long giant beetle. Even in this oxygen-rich environment, such a colossal insect was a rare sight on land. In addition to its massive claws, the beetle had 8 spider-like legs, a peculiar combination that made it a true oddity among its kind, the undisputed dandy of the insect world. Chapter 97, Awakening. Luo Wen was jolted awake by a cacophony of guagua sounds. The irritation of being disturbed from his long slumber left him seething with rage. The extended period of hibernation had left his mind sluggish and blank, unable to recall anything immediately. For now, his overwhelming hunger took precedence as his bodily functions slowly resumed. Instinctively, he tore at the cocoon encasing his body. Having been inactive for so long, his movements were stiff and clumsy, as if his body had rusted over. When he finally managed to rip through the cocoon, he found the desiccated material devoid of any nutritional value. To his despair, he discovered another, tougher wall beyond it. Which wretched soul had the nerve to glue this place shut? Luo Wen cursed groggily. The constant guagua noises from above only aggravated his mood further. Gathering a modicum of strength, his massive claws guided by his keen, high refresh rate compound eyes began to chip away at a specific point on the wall. At long last, a small hole was breached. With this initial crack, the task became much easier. Luo Wen used his claws to claw, pry, and dig, gradually widening the opening. Chunks of tightly packed dirt began to fall into the enclosed cavern. The hole grew larger until loose, and bonded soil started spilling into the chamber. This soil offered no resistance to Luo Wen's massive claws, unlike the solidified chunks. Luo Wen grabbed some of the loose dirt and stuffed it into his mouth, temporarily alleviating his gnawing hunger. However, the nutrients he could extract from the dirt were minimal, a stopgap solution that couldn't truly sate him. Time was of the essence. After a brief respite, Luo Wen resumed digging. Fortunately, his claws were as effective at tunneling as any specialized burrower's legs. In a short time, he had carved out an upward path. Luckily, the earthquake that had recently shaken the area had caused the earth's crust to shift, bringing Luo Wen closer to the surface. The once deep cavern was now only 20 or 30 meters underground. Still, this short distance proved to be a grueling challenge. By the time Luo Wen broke through to the surface and inhaled his first breath of fresh air, he was on the verge of total exhaustion. There, he finally found the source of the noise that had awakened him. The sight of a frog with bulbous eyes greeted him. One glance was enough to confirm its exceptional vision. His long-dormant camouflage abilities sprang to life. Instinctively, Luo Wen activated them. Colors shifted and shimmered across his body, the once black surface morphing into a dazzling array of hues. In moments, Luo Wen seemed to vanish, blending seamlessly into his surroundings. He crept toward the dark green frog with deliberate care, nervous about his diminished state. This might be his only chance. Success meant meat, failure meant dirt. As his claws neared striking range, the frog appeared to sense something amiss but remained still. Luo Wen exhaled in relief and activated a weakened version of his dual-curve attack system. Wind roared as his massive claw pierced the frog's body and continued downward, pinning it deep into the soil. It had been so long since Luo Wen hunted personally that his strength control was off, ruining a portion of the fresh prey. But in his current state, he couldn't afford to be picky. Even if 2 pounds of aphid dung were placed before him, he would have devoured it without hesitation. After gorging himself, Luo Wen felt a small amount of energy return, and his intellect began to reawaken. Memories from before his hibernation trickled back into his mind. Before he could delve deeper into his thoughts, a rhythmic vibration emanated from the ground, sending him into a panic. Another earthquake, he wondered, alarmed. Focusing carefully, he realized that the tremors felt like the movements of a massive creature stomping across the land. Fortunately, the source of the disturbance was still some distance away. Luo Wen's heightened senses, evident in his ability to hear a frog's croak from deep underground, seemed even sharper than before. With the immediate threat averted, Luo Wen took a moment to survey his surroundings. Tall trees lay toppled in all directions, some even uprooted. Cracks riddled the ground, evidence of a seismic event. Yet, the types of trees around him were unfamiliar. Given that the swarm had once dominated most of the continental landmass, unfamiliar flora was a rarity. Then his gaze landed on the spot where the frog had vanished, and realization dawned. This species was something he had encountered during his human days. Since becoming an insect, he hadn't seen anything like it. The realization prompted 3 soul-piercing questions. How long was I asleep? Where am I? Have I crossed into another world again? The scant information available, coupled with the unknown conditions outside, made exploration too risky. For now, Luo Wen prioritized regrowing the brood nest. After all, his path was that of the collective. Without subordinates, he felt an unsettling emptiness. The area was once home to a small stream, but the earthquake had altered the terrain. The stream now needed to carve a new path. The region was scattered with small pools of water, and thin trickles flowed beneath the fallen trees and weeds. Occasionally, the croaks of frogs echoed from the surroundings. Luo Wen's fine body scales began to work, cloaking him from sight. Avoiding the pools as much as possible, he crept toward the source of the sounds. While frogs were natural predators of insects, perfectly equipped to catch them, the massive size difference between these frogs and Luo Wen rendered such predation irrelevant. For example, if humans were the size of ants, they wouldn't stand a chance unarmed. But with the size disparity in their favor, a single stomp could decimate an ant colony. Here, the frogs were too small, their abilities countered by Luo Wen's stealth. Their eyes, evolved to track swift-flying insects, were useless against his camouflage. Robbed of their advantage, the frogs couldn't even flee in time. After skewering and devouring several frogs, Luo Wen's hunger remained unappeased. His body was severely depleted, and the frogs were quickly metabolized into energy. During his hunt, Luo Wen noticed several flying insects flitting about. Flight had once been a coveted ability of his. Back when the swarm controlled vast territories, he had never seen a single flying insect. Yet here, they seemed ubiquitous. This revelation sparked his three soul-piercing questions once again. The small insects, due to their size, proved challenging for Luo Wen's claws. Even with the weakened dual-curve system, his attacks were straightforward and inflexible, unsuited for such agile targets. Fortunately, Luo Wen had more than just claws in his arsenal. Against these nimble, small targets, he had a far more effective weapon. Chapter 98, Pterodactyl. A long, fur-covered leg darted out from the void like lightning. Guided by Luo Wen's superior dynamic vision, it struck a flying green beetle with pinpoint accuracy. The fine, adhesive hairs on the claw at the leg's tip gripped the green beetle tightly, pulling it toward Luo Wen. To Luo Wen, this beetle was akin to a miraculous little pill that could sprout wings. Without hesitation, he popped it into his mouth. Crunch! After skewering a few more frogs, Luo Wen encountered yet another unfamiliar creature. By now, he was growing numb to the bizarre sights, and the idea of having traversed to another world filled his mind again. This animal stood nearly half a meter tall, resembling a cross between a rat and a dog. Its muzzle wasn't pronounced, leaning toward a flat shape, and a cluster of white whiskers sprouted from its chin, giving it a goofy expression. Its smooth, light yellow fur covered its entire body. This was the first furred creature Luo Wen had seen since becoming an insect and apparent mammal. The creature's stocky, short limbs were folded beneath its body as it squatted on the ground, gnawing on an unknown plant fruit cradled in its forelimbs. Its round, beady eyes scanned its surroundings warily. Behind it trailed a thick, unusual tail common enough in concept, but this specific style was truly unique. Luo Wen decided to invite it for dinner to discuss the mysteries of genetic evolution. Fearful it might decline, he activated his optical camouflage and cautiously approached. His claws gradually entered attack range, but the creature's keen vigilance became evident. Though Luo Wen's optical camouflage rendered him invisible, unavoidable sounds betrayed his movements. The peculiar animal froze mid-bite, its hidden ears pricking through its fur. Although it detected nothing specific, its cautious instincts prompted it to retreat. Grabbing the fruit in its mouth, it lowered itself onto all fours and prepared to leave. Suddenly, a massive beetle burst from behind it. The speed of the ambush caused a brief disruption in Luo Wen's optical camouflage, rendering him momentarily iridescent. One claw struck the strange creature's body first. While its dense fur provided decent defense against piercing attacks, the immense force accompanying the strike sent it flying and inflicted significant damage. Luo Wen leaped forward in a burst, closing the gap as the creature struggled to rise. Seizing the moment, he lunged, wrapping his entire body around it. His 8 legs locked it in place. Although not his primary weapons, Luo Wen's legs were lined with spines and bristles, adding formidable offensive capability that had seen little use until now. He also possessed another underutilized weapon, venom. The spider-derived fangs he had gained from his genetic template had rarely seen action. Until now, Luo Wen had faced few opponents of similar size. Most battles were decided by sheer physical dominance, and his growing swarm had all but eliminated the need for personal combat. This creature, measuring half a meter long, was smaller and weaker than Luo Wen, but it finally allowed him to put his full arsenal to use. His fangs pierced through the creature's fur and into its body. Venom glands emptied their contents swiftly through the hollow channels in his fangs. Inexperienced with venom use, Luo Wen erred on the side of caution and injected the entire dose. Sensing the imminent threat to its life, the strange creature struggled violently. Unfortunately, its stout, sharp-looking claws couldn't penetrate Luo Wen's armor. Realizing its futile struggle, the creature launched a desperate counterattack. Seizing an opportunity, it bit down on the joint of Luo Wen's claw. Although the joint was armored, the inner curve had thinner plating for mobility. The creature's two sharp incisors punctured the joint membrane with ease. The injury was minor, but the incisors became stuck, rendering them immovable. For a moment, an awkward silence settled between predator and prey. Then, a bizarre cry echoed from above, rapidly growing closer. In all his past battles, Luo Wen had never been attacked from the sky. While his nearly 360-degree field of vision covered most threats, he instinctively overlooked aerial dangers. Moreover, while his compound eyes excelled in detail and refresh rate, their range was limited despite constant improvements. His maximum field of view was only around 300 meters. Previously, when his enemies were either blind or nearsighted, 300 meters felt like an expansive range. Now, it fell short. The source of the cry finally appeared in Luo Wen's sight, and what he saw left him dumbstruck. It was a pterodactyl. What kind of crazy place is this? Luo Wen wondered, as his mind reeled with the three soul-piercing questions once again. But this wasn't the time for deep reflection. The pterodactyl folded its wings and dove, its massive body accelerating rapidly under gravity's pull. It closed the 300-meter distance in an instant. For the first time, Luo Wen faced such a predicament. Entangled with the strange creature, his mobility was severely limited. The venom had subdued his prey, leaving its full weight dangling from its incisors locked into Luo Wen's claw joint. If Luo Wen had been alone, he could have easily escaped using his powerful leap or optical camouflage. But what had been a promising meal just moments ago had now become a deadly burden. Despite his frantic attempts to free himself, his claws lacked the dexterity of fingers, and his panic only caused the incisors to lodge more firmly. Left with no choice, Luo Wen activated his optical camouflage, hoping against hope that the pterodactyl wouldn't see him. It was a self-deceptive comfort at best. As the pterodactyl neared the ground, its folded wings spread wide, transforming its dive into a glide as it passed just above Luo Wen. Relieved, Luo Wen exhaled until the pterodactyl banked sharply, adjusted its posture, and flew straight at him again. This time, the pterodactyl extended its massive talons. It was enormous, its wings casting a dark shadow over the ground as it passed. Luo Wen estimated its wingspan to be at least 7 or 8 meters. If they could communicate, Luo Wen might have tried to reason with it, pointing out the absurdity of attacking two measly creatures barely half a meter long. The pterodactyl dove again, its talons grasping the furred creature. Unfortunately for Luo Wen, he was tangled with his prey and was swept up along with it into the pterodactyl's grip. Chapter 99, Aerial Combat. The pterosaur had not expected an additional gain. After seizing its prey, it began a rapid ascent. The fierce wind howled past, and the intense air pressure made Luo Wen's eyes feel extremely uncomfortable, impairing his vision. His eyes started secreting fluid, forming a thin membrane-like covering. This was a skill Luo Wen had acquired from the submersible bug. Unexpectedly, it proved not only effective underwater but also quite useful in the sky. Regaining his ability to see, Luo Wen noticed the ground rapidly receding until it faded beyond his vision, becoming a blur. This indicated that he had been carried to at least 300 meters above the ground, and the pterosaur showed no sign of stopping as it continued to ascend. Since becoming an insect, Luo Wen had only suffered during the initial hatching phase. Once the brood nest was established, he had gradually begun living a life akin to a lord. If he hadn't been so picky himself, he could have even had dedicated bugs feeding him. This perilous situation was something Luo Wen hadn't encountered in a long time. Adding to his troubles, he had only recently awakened, his mind was still groggy, and his stomach was yet to be filled. Surrounded by strange creatures, he felt as though he were in a dream, a surreal and unreal experience. Yet, the smooth fur beneath his hands, the hard claws gripping him, and the occasional cheerful chirps from the creature above kept pulling Luo Wen back to reality. Shaking his head to clear his thoughts, Luo Wen realized he could no longer discern his altitude. White clouds surrounded him, and the temperature had dropped sharply, though the cold didn't pose much of a threat to him. It was unclear where the pterosaur intended to take him, but it was unlikely to be a friendly place. Once there, his single opponent might turn into a group. This was not a flight Luo Wen wanted to continue. He had to find a way to disembark early. Though the pterosaur's large wingspan made it appear massive, its actual body was likely less than 2 meters long. From Luo Wen's angle, he could even see its unprotected soft underbelly. Moreover, Luo Wen had a tremendously powerful long-range attack that he had never used in combat before. Extending his right claw, he assumed an attack posture. The full-powered hyperbolic system began charging, aimed directly at the target. Even a weakened version of the hyperbolic system was challenging for Luo Wen to control. Now, with the complete version, aiming was purely a matter of chance. To make matters worse, both the pterosaur and Luo Wen were in rapid motion. The turbulence from the pterosaur's flight made it difficult for him to stabilize. Whether he could hit the target was anyone's guess. But the arrow was knocked, there was no turning back. A deafening sonic boom resounded as the hyperbolic system fully discharged. In that instant, Luo Wen's right claw accelerated to supersonic speed, detaching from his body and shooting upward into the sky before vanishing. The pterosaur's body was struck first on its right side, leaving a gash. The attack then pierced through the base of its wing. The claw's extreme speed generated such high temperatures that the wounds cauterized instantly, leaving the pterosaur with barely a drop of blood lost. If this had occurred on land, Luo Wen's self-sacrificial attack might have gone to waste. However, at such close range, the damage was not limited to mere physical trauma. Before the pterosaur could even register the pain, a massive sonic boom followed, stunning it. The unexpected impact left the pterosaur dizzy, its head ringing. Reeling from the dual blow, the pterosaur involuntarily released its grip, losing its prey as it began spiraling downward, its punctured wing leaking air. Although Luo Wen had escaped its claws, he was far from safe. The pterosaur's earlier cheerful calls had attracted its kin, which had been lurking in the clouds. Now, seeing the first pterosaur lose its prey, they swarmed toward the falling Luo Wen. Due to their position beyond his line of sight, Luo Wen couldn't tell how many of them were preparing to attack. But based on the sounds coming from different directions, he estimated there were at least 3. With his right claw already lost in pursuit of its dream and his left claw jammed at the joint by the bizarre creature's teeth, Luo Wen was in free fall, unable to leverage any foothold. It was as though he had entirely lost the ability to resist. The situation was even more dire than before. Faced with a life-and-death crisis, Luo Wen's intellect surged. He displayed a hidden talent. This skill, borrowed from a type of deep-sea crab, involved deliberately shedding a claw when facing an irresistible attack to distract the predator while escaping. Luo Wen had never imagined he would need this skill, having long since forgotten it. Caught off guard by the aerial assault, he had been half a beat too slow to react decisively. Had he shed his claw the moment the pterosaur attacked, he wouldn't have had so much trouble later. But there was no point dwelling on past mistakes. The situation was what it was, and he could only treat it as a valuable lesson for the future. At the root joint of his left claw, a segment opened, detaching the claw. As it fell away, Luo Wen used his legs to push it, along with the attached creature, with all his might. The recoil sent Luo Wen hurtling in the opposite direction. Simultaneously, he activated his optical camouflage system. Though the rapid motion caused a slight delay in the system's operation, the monochromatic sky environment minimized its impact. From the pterosaur's perspective, the peculiar yellow-furred creature seemed to glide a short distance through the air. Then, the black insect clinging to its back vanished entirely. Their limited brain capacity didn't allow the pterosaurs to ponder deeply. They pursued the brightly colored creature instead. The smaller pterosaurs began a fierce aerial struggle. Their sizes were nowhere near that of the first pterosaur, which was why they had dared only to trail and not snatch the prey before. But now that the larger predator was injured and retreating, the prey it had dropped became the prize for their persistence. Being similar in size, none of the smaller pterosaurs could easily overpower the others. As their quarry approached the ground, they grew increasingly desperate, as the ground was not their domain. Driven by the mindset of a bite is better than nothing, one pterosaur took the initiative and jabbed its sharp beak into the creature. Unbeknownst to them, the peculiar creature had long since died. Its muscles had liquefied under the effects of Luo Wen's excessive venom injection. Though its skeleton and fur held its shape, it was essentially a giant water balloon. Under the pterosaur's attack, the creature's thick hide gradually tore open, unable to withstand the pressure. Finally, with a loud pop, the creature exploded. The sudden eruption and splattering fluids startled the pterosaurs, scattering them. By the time they looked back, all that remained was a tattered patch of fur drifting in the wind. Chapter 100, Landing. The aerial battle above was beyond Luo Wen's field of vision, and now, he faced a new problem. The last time he experienced a free fall from such a height, he had been no larger than a fingernail, and various forces could easily affect his descent. Even a gentle breeze could significantly slow his fall. That earlier experience had ingrained a certain mindset in him: high-altitude falls couldn't harm him. However, his current body was over 60 centimeters long, and while his thick exoskeletal armor provided strong protection, it was not light. His weight might now exceed 50 kilograms. At such a mass, only a strong gale could slow his descent. Unfortunately, the weather was sunny and calm, with not even a breeze in the air, let alone a gale. In this situation, Luo Wen wasn't sure if his body could withstand the impact of landing safely. He couldn't leave things to fate, he needed to draw on his meager knowledge to improve his chances of survival. Stretching out all 8 of his legs to increase his body's surface area, he tried to maximize resistance. His rapid descent slowed slightly, providing a momentary buffer, but it was far from enough to stop him from plummeting. Luo Wen cursed under his breath. If he could just sleep for a bit, maybe he'd grow a pair of wings and avoid such indignities altogether. Thankfully, he had already shed his 2 heaviest claws earlier, otherwise, those alone each weighing 7 or 8 kilograms would have added significantly to his burden. Suddenly, an idea struck him. The air sacs located between his carapace and abdomen began inflating rapidly. These sacs, initially designed as underwater oxygen tanks, had become almost redundant after Luo Wen acquired underwater breathing capabilities. Unexpectedly, they now proved invaluable. It truly seemed that no skill was ever useless, a fact the ancients were right about. The air sacs expanded to their limit, even distorting Luo Wen's abdomen. But the effect was remarkable, significantly reducing his descent speed. However, this created a new issue. The sacs were located in the rear half of his body, causing Luo Wen's position to shift from a horizontal spread to a head-down dive. With his claws gone, he had no way to shield his head and would have to rely on his armor to endure the impact. This was far from an ideal outcome. As the ground drew closer, tall treetops began appearing in Luo Wen's field of vision. He struggled to align his fall toward the treetops. Despite his efforts, his descent trajectory barely changed. Luckily, the forest below was dense, with layer upon layer of interwoven tree canopies that blocked out the sunlight. From above, the ground beneath the foliage was completely obscured. When he was about 10 meters above the treetops, Luo Wen strained his body into a pull-up motion. Using his immense core strength, he lifted his head momentarily. In that instant, his carapace and abdomen compressed together, forcefully expelling the air from the sacs. The resulting jet of air shifted Luo Wen's trajectory by a few centimeters. He then spread out his legs and fell onto the treetop. The canopy couldn't bear his weight, and Luo Wen crashed through the layers of branches and leaves, continuing his descent toward the ground. The branches scratched against his body, but at most, they left faint marks on his exoskeleton armor, far from piercing it. These scratches, however, steadily reduced his falling momentum. Finally, after multiple layers of cushioning, Luo Wen landed on the ground. The impact caused only mild vibrations, hardly enough to qualify as a light injury. Upon landing, Luo Wen didn't dare linger. His fall had made quite a commotion. Furthermore, the moment he entered the canopy, his compound eyes caught sight of another treetop shaking violently nearby. Given the height and thickness of the trees, whatever caused such movement had to be a massive creature. Having already encountered pterosaurs, Luo Wen had no desire to satisfy any curiosity. He had lost both claws, depleted the venom stored in his glands, and, having not eaten enough, was now severely exhausted, a state of extreme vulnerability. His best course of action was to lie low, sleep, and regenerate his claws. Maybe he'd even sprout a pair of wings. Unfortunately, without claws that could double as digging tools, burrowing into the ground was out of the question. And given his unfamiliar surroundings, finding a suitable tree hollow in the short term seemed equally unlikely. Luckily, the dense forest floor was covered with a thick layer of decomposing leaves. Though the smell was unpleasant, this was no time to be picky. Luo Wen began by biting into an exposed tree root nearby, intending to quench his thirst. This familiar action reminded him of his days of weakness, evoking a sense of nostalgia. But he was no longer the size of a fingernail. It took him biting into 7 or 8 spots and nearly half an hour to drink his fill. In the distance, vibrations reached Luo Wen's sensitive leg hairs. He had learned his lesson, however, keeping his optical camouflage active throughout. The local creatures seemed to have sharp vision, making his previously underappreciated stealth feature incredibly effective. During this time, Luo Wen even managed to ambush a few small, brightly colored birds. Their feathers were stunningly vibrant, but now they were gathering for a meeting in Luo Wen's stomach. The birds were so small and feathery that Luo Wen couldn't taste much before they were gone, leaving him wanting more. What he wouldn't give for one of those plump, yellow-furred creatures from before something that was large and filling. As he gnawed on the tree root, Luo Wen's mouth watered at the thought. Finally full, he sought a complex terrain to hide in. He found a spot between 3 giant trees. The thick trunks formed a natural barrier, making it difficult for creatures to pass through, evident from the undisturbed layer of fallen leaves. Unaware of what large predators might be roaming, Luo Wen didn't want to risk falling asleep somewhere only to be crushed underfoot by a passing behemoth. Using his legs, he clumsily scraped out a hole in the decaying leaves. Taking a deep breath, he buried his head inside and covered the entrance. Surrounded by the damp and sticky decay, Luo Wen let his mind drift to distract himself, eventually falling asleep. His exact location remained a mystery, and the duration of his slumber was unclear. Since waking, countless unexpected events had occurred, leaving him with little time to explore the myriad abilities acquired through the self-sacrifice of trillions of bugs in the past. T/N, the Big 100. I've really enjoyed translating this novel so far. It's got me hooked, lol. No spoilers, but all I can say that it's only up from here.